Welcome to a financial planning podcast with a down-to-earth vibe. Sasquatch listens while slapping on suntan lotion by the pond in the forest. We're going to chat about revocable living family trusts today. So our advisors on this episode, we welcome back Rex.m.baxter and Brandyn Smith with planwithbaxter.com 2023-2024 Forbes Best in State Wealth Management Teams for Utah, Advisor Hubs, or is it Advisor Hub? One hub?
One hub.
Advisor Hub, fastest growing advisors to watch under $1 billion, and the receivers of the Ameriprise Client Experience Award, Rex and Brandyn from Baxter Smith and Associates. Thanks for being here today. Okay, so let's chat about revocable living family trust. Why do we use trusts? What are the parts that make up a trust? What is the lifestyle or life cycle? A lifestyle would be interesting. What is the life cycle of a typical trust, and what other documents do people usually have prepared when they're doing their revocable living trust? So let's start with the basics right now. What is a trust? What does revocable mean? And what are we getting ourselves into here today, Rex?
Well, I hope we're not getting ourselves into a snooze fest because I love trust.
You love trust.
And so this can
Trust me, I love trust.
I do. I love trust, and I love estate planning, and it's one of the things that I feel.
Why is that?
You know, I think it's the creativity that can go into them.
Okay.
Is because there's not a lot of limitations other than the limitations that you put on them yourselves.
Okay.
And so I like that creativity of making the documents, and we don't make the documents, but working with the attorney to make the documents so it works for you and your family the best way possible. And that's why I really kind of get into them. And so this is definitely a passion of mine, something I'm a little bit knowledge about and kind of deep into.
Yeah.
And so
this is you geek out on trust.
Yeah. And so that's but some people might not get the same enthusiasm.
Well, I'm glad you have enthusiasm, because then we would never get it if you weren't. So, because we'd be like, this is a snooze fest. So, this is great. So let's talk about what is it and like define a trust for us real quick.
Yeah. So a trust is essentially just a document that is providing guidance as to how your assets, your financial assets, your physical assets are to be handled both during your lifetime and beyond your lifetime.
Okay.
And so, one of the attorneys that we work with quite frequently, he uses the phrase of a trust directs who gets what when. And that's what a trust is going to do for you. Is it's going to define the who, and it's going to define what it is that we're dealing with, and it's going to define who gets it when that time frame happens.
Okay. And this is why do we use trusts, but what happens if you don't use a trust?
Yeah, the main reason, the biggest why, and this gets confused sometimes. People are like, oh man, my spouse is sick, or, I need to get my trust in place. And that's probably good. Like, it's good to get your estate work in place. But the biggest reason people use trust, in my opinion, is for passing assets on to beneficiaries. And that can be, there's different phases of life. And so, I'm a little bit younger. We've got a young family. We've got kids that are young. And so the last thing, and as part of financial planning, I have life insurance on myself. So if I were to pass away, my wife's taken care of. And she has some. So if she passed away, I could spend some more time with my kids. And so we've got that life insurance coverage. But if we both passed away together and the assets we've accumulated, that's quite a healthy sum of money that I don't want to go to my kids when they turn 18. And so a trust helps me dictate and help plan for my kids. So if both my wife and I were gone, they get taken care of, and we can kind of go into the details of the strategy of that. But then later in life, it comes down, maybe your kids are all adults, but maybe one kid has special needs, or maybe one kid can't control or manage money, or maybe there's an addiction problem, or maybe you just simply don't want all of your assets to go through probate and be a public record, right? That a judge decides who gets what and when and how. And so all of those reasons are reasons people have a trust, but it all comes down to one main reason, and that is to be able to have a say in how your assets are distributed when you pass away.
Okay. So that's a pretty good reason, Rex. Any others?
Yeah, I think one of the common misconceptions that I hear, probably the most common misconception I hear, is I don't have enough assets to do a trust. And they get that opinion a lot from the media, because the media and the tax law is that you can pass up to 12.6 million, 13 million.
13.61.
Yeah, 13.61. 13.61 million from me to my kids tax-free.
Okay.
And there's no death tax, no estate tax, right? And if we do planning properly, then my wife could also pass an additional 13.61 million to the kids. So we could protect up to 27 million.
Just under the gun there.
Right. And so people think, well, my estate's under that, significantly under that. And so why do I need a trust? It's going to pass tax-free anyway, so why do I need a trust?
Good question. Yeah.
And that's the most common misconception. To me, people do a trust for convenience, to avoid the probate and to provide some direction to what they want to have happen to their money. And should an 18-year-old child receive $1 million inheritance at age 18, or should it happen at different ages? And there's not a right or wrong answer there. It's just what's right or wrong for your family. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you get to control a little bit through doing estate planning and trust work.
And I think at a fundamental level, the courts are inefficient. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. But if you become incapacitated, and now it's up to the courts to grant and say, hey, yeah, you're in, it just takes time. Mm-hmm. And trusts, some people say, I want to appoint who takes care of me if I'm incapacitated, right? This daughter would be really nice to me. I don't know about this daughter or this son, right? And so a trust allows you to say, hey, if I can't make decisions for myself, or if I'm not here to say what goes to who or where, this is what I want to have happen. And different from a will can do that too, but a will is not a binding document, right? It's not an entity. Whereas a trust actually, if the successor trustee doesn't distribute it according to your wishes, then you can have those cross lawsuits say, hey, this was supposed to go this way and this is why, and it's all documented.
Yeah, a will is more like a pirate book, right? It's more of a guideline.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so direction to the court. Okay. And typically the court follows that, but it can be contested. It can be, a court may look at it at the person that you're putting in charge and say, yeah, that's no. That's not going to happen.
The pirate code is more of a guideline.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What's the typical cost of doing setting up a trust so that you pay this now, so you don't have to worry about or your family doesn't have to worry about all these problems later?
So I think it changes based on your geography, right? And so sometimes in smaller towns you may get a little bit of a lower cost. Still high quality work, just probably lower cost. In some of the bigger towns, it may cost a little bit more. The most common price ranges that I've seen on trust work range from about $1,500 to about $4,000 currently, is what I've seen. I think in my mind, the one thing that you want to make sure of is you want to make sure that the attorney that you're using, that this is what they do. This isn't one of 8 things that they do, and it might only make up 5% of their business. And so you want to get it right. You want to make sure that it will hold up if it is ever challenged. And you want to make sure that there's not a lot of ambiguity language inside of it that just isn't clear.
Have you seen like TRUSTSonline.com or what? Like, are there like basic websites that kick out a basic trust and that people would use, and I'm sure you would not recommend?
Yeah, if you name it, I've seen it. I've seen it
really?
from websites. I've seen it from handwritten by people looking at 10 different websites and trying to pick and choose, and you get in all these little circular references that essentially nullify almost the entire trust, and it doesn't grant the authority to the right people at the right times. I mean, if you name it, I've seen it. Probably
talk to a professional.
Right.
Talk to a professional. Okay. So that is why we do use trusts. What are all the parts of the trust, I guess? Did we cover all of that yet? I mean,
yeah, we kind of mentioned it in another podcast, but I think it would be good to go over that again in this podcast. Kind of the hope that anyone who's considering a trust maybe listen and kind of get some ideas. Obviously, Rex and I, we're not attorneys, right? This isn't legal advice, but like Rex said, we've seen so many trusts. But
you're financial planners, and this is what you would recommend as a financial planner, right?
Yes. Yep. Okay. Yep. Absolutely. So when you have a trust, there are a few different players in a trust. The first one, and probably the most prominent, is the grantor, right? And the grantor is the person who donates the assets. So typically in most scenarios, right, you have a husband and wife and they have all their assets. They are the grantors. They're going to create this trust, and then they're going to put their house in the trust, right? The ownership of the house will be in the name of the trust. They might put certain bank accounts or assets that they have. They'll put all of those into the trust. Those are the grantors. They are granting the trust. They're creating the trust. They're funding the trust. Then you have the trustee, which typically is also the same as the grantor, right? But the trustee is whoever you want to be in charge to make things happen that are supposed to happen within the trust. So typically what we see is the grantors, they create the trust, they fund the trust, and then they appoint themselves as the trustees. And you can have multiple trustees. And what we usually see on those is that hey, the trustees have authority to do whatever they want within the trust, right? Full flexibility. This is a typical revocable trust that we're talking about. Then you have your successor trustees. And this is where the estate planning happens, right? Because if you're a trustee, you and your wife, your trustees, and then you both pass away, you need someone to be able to administer and like do what is needed in the trust, right? So those successor and feel free to jump in, Rex, if I'm
No, you're doing
just
great.
run through it. But the successor trustees, typically 1 or 2 kids, right? And it's their job to, make sure all the things listed in the trust happen. Usually that's just distributions, right? It's something like the successor trustee should sell the house within a reasonable time frame and split it evenly between the kids, right? But as successor trustee, they have authority to sign for that. They have authority to sell the house. They have authority to liquidate assets in an investment account. Those are your successor trustees. Then you have your beneficiaries. Your beneficiaries are the people receiving the money. And a lot of times the successor trustee is also a beneficiary, right? But all these things are flexible. Like Rex said, I mean, you can have a completely independent trustee that then distributes money to beneficiaries if you're worried that there could be some contention. There might be some extra costs to that. Right now we have to hire another trustee. But usually we just see successor trustees are the kids, and then the kids are also the beneficiaries. And then the final part of this is the trust document itself. And that has incredible amounts of flexibility. This is where we see like if you were to watch a movie, right? And they're like, you have to come live on the family farm for 9 months before you inherit any of the assets, right? Mm-hmm. You can literally put that in your document. Now, all your kids might say, that's bogus. I'm not doing it, right? But at the end of the day, it's up to the legal authority of the successor trustee to not give them any assets unless they've satisfied the direction of the trust. And that's an extreme example, but you can see how that can be taken into other areas, right? If someone's having financial issues or if they're having addiction issues or whatever it is, you can try and help someone. Or if your kids are just too young, right? And you need to help them mature in age, and you don't want to just dump a ton of money on them. You have a trustee, a successor trustee, that kind of manages when they get the money and how they get the money. And for example, right, like in mine, I want to cover like the cost of education for my kids. If I'm not here, I want that covered for them. And so my kids would have like a copy of the trust document and say, hey, look, it says here that my education needs can be met. They would go to who I appointed as the successor trustee. Right now it's my mom, right? And they would go to her and say, hey, can you reimburse this school expense? And she might say yes or no, right? Or that's not really a school.
You might say that Ferrari is not a school.
That's not a school. And I know I'm going to be working on it, right? And so that's what's so fun about the trust is that you can, as a grantor and a creator of the trust document, I can articulate exactly how much leeway I want to grant, right? Do I want my mom to be able to just like grant anything that she thinks is a good idea? For me, yes, right? For me, I trust that. I trust that process. I trust her. I trust my kids. That's fine. But like, you might not. You might not trust that, and you might want to specify you can have this much, but no more than this. And so that all is just personal preference on that.
Okay. Very interesting. Sounds like a lot at play. Rex, did you want to add to the parts of a trust?
That was a lot.
That
I
was
know.
a lot.
Sorry, guys. I'm like, it's going on and on.
No, I think those are the basics, right? You've got your grantors that you mentioned, your trustees, which are who is in charge today, your successor trustees, who are in charge when you become incapacitated or pass away, or when you choose you don't want to be in charge of it anymore. And then you have your beneficiaries. And so those are the basic titles that you're going to run into. And as you're preparing to do your trust, you just want to think that through. And so lots of times on those successor trustees, it doesn't have to be your oldest, right? It can be your oldest, but you want it to be somebody that is financially aware, is comfortable, dealing with the intricacies of the family and dealing with a little bit of that conflict that may arise, and comfortable working with the professionals needed to get everything accomplished. Sometimes that's one successor trustee, sometimes it's two, sometimes it's an odd number to three, so that you've got a tiebreaker in there. And so it's different for everybody, and lots of times there'll be different levels. And so we typically on successor trustees go 2 or 3 levels deep, just in case the first one passes in an accident with you, or declines to do it, or some other life event happens.
Yeah, a good trust is a trust that doesn't have to be updated anytime anything changes. And so we see in that a lot of contingencies, like Rex said, right? Like, this is the successor trustee, but if they're unable or unwilling to act, then go to this person. If they're unable, then go to this person. And so you have some depth to that, because you never know where people are going to be in life, 10 years down.
Yeah, and things get weird, and you don't want that either. So
Things get what does that mean?
things get weird. Well, when it comes to for the trust to take action, if it's in family gets weird, and so if you've got things in place and there's not a lot of leeway there, like this is what's
there's
supposed
direction.
to happen. There's direction, and that's a good thing.
Right. Everyone's not sitting around saying, well, who do we think should take the kids? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like you I don't want like you have they wanted this.
Yeah.
And the trust document typically doesn't dictate who gets the kids or takes the kids, right? Typically that's through the will, and that appoints the guardian of who's going to be the guardian of the kids through the estate planning. And so there's different documents in an estate plan, and the trust has a certain role, so do powers of attorney, and we'll go through a few of the different documents that are in play. The one thing that I would mention, we talk about tips and tricks and things like that, is communication is key. I can't tell you how often I run across to where a family, mom and dad, have created a trust, and they haven't told anybody. It's like the little black box. Nobody can know what's in the trust until I'm gone. And that creates a lot of anxious moments and even some family conflict with the kids because it wasn't communicated clearly.
Yeah.
Right.
And if one of your goals, and this doesn't need to be your goal, everybody can set their own goals. I'm not dictating what your goal is. But if one of your goals is to try and keep your family together and try and keep
a good goal.
some harmony in that family, communication is key.
Yeah.
Right. I was just talking to someone the other day who said, we're not giving our kids anything. Our kids are set, they're successful, they don't need anything. We're giving it all to our grandkids to try and help them, set them up for success. And they're like, but we haven't told our kids yet. I'm sure they will, right? And they'll get to
Maybe.
it. But that could be a shocker.
Yeah.
And I've been a part of, where I'm working with parents and kids, and the parents are saying, oh yeah, they're good, they've got all the money they'll ever need. And the kids are kind of like, well, I'm kind of banking on a little bit of inheritance. We haven't saved like we should have, and they haven't talked about their personal financial situations. And so the parents are like, oh, they're good, they don't need anything. The kids are like, yeah, I'm really expecting something, eventually. And man, that's a hard trust reading when you read that. You're like, whoa, they just skipped me, And I'm not saying that's bad, right? Because that might be the right answer. But like Rex said, if we can add some communication and just make sure everyone's on the same page, or is able to like voice a concern, like, wait, this doesn't work. That works a lot better.
Okay. So the life cycle of a typical trust, what does that look like, Brandon?
Yeah, what kind of question is that?
I don't know.
Just kidding.
It's in my notes.
Yeah, so with a trust, and all trusts can be very unique and different, right? But what we typically see is first the creation of the trust. The trust is created. That's the grantors meeting with an attorney and saying this is what we want to have created. I made this up, so bear with me, right? But
this part, you didn't make up trust.
That's true. These life cycle phases, I thought this was a good idea. Anyway, so then you've got the initial phase, And that's while the grantor and the trustees, right, the initial people who created the trust are still alive. And that's usually the longest part of a trust. With a typical revocable family trust like we see, there's really not a lot of changes. Like I have a trust, my home is owned by my trust. Does that change anything in my day-to-day? Not at all. When we bought it, I signed as a trustee rather than signing as an individual. But like, it doesn't really change a lot. I've got like my contingent beneficiaries on my IRAs and 401ks as the trust, right? So that the trust will take over. Does that change anything in my life? No. I guess what I'm trying to say is when you are the trustee of a trust, of a living revocable trust, there's really not usually a lot of changes to your life. You have full access to the money, full control of the money. You can move money out of it. It's really there as what happens if something happens to my wife and I, that direction. So that's
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
What happens, however, if you set your trust up in early enough in life or in a stage of your life where there's some things that change later? So
Right.
you've got more assets later, like a lot more, like a business maybe that you started after it, or some real estate that you acquired after it. Like how do you go in and adjust all of that?
Great question. Yeah, so that's just a trust amendment. I see some people who have trusts from 2 decades ago and nothing's really changed. We recommend they review their trust, right? They look through it. When you read through it, you're like, oh, wait a minute, that person passed or whatever it is. But you should review your trust every 3 to 5 years. Beyond that, you really only need to amend a trust if there are significant changes, but that does happen.
So the most common ways to do that, one is an amendment, which would be a specific provision amendment. So I'm going to amend Article 2, Paragraph 3 to say this instead, right? And that's typically where you do an amendment.
I'm going to give Johnny his
time,
inheritance again.
Right,
We
right.
see that.
He's back in. He's back.
He's
in
back
the
in.
trust. He's back. He is
Johnny
back.
apologized. Good. Okay.
So that's where you do a single amendment. Typically, an attorney's going to just charge their hourly rate to make a quick amendment like that.
Okay.
So it's not very expensive typically because it's one paragraph. The other way, and a lot of attorneys prefer this, especially if you end up changing attorneys throughout your life, they prefer to do what's called an amendment and restatement. And so essentially, lots of times you'll do a trust. Let's say you do a trust in your 30s. You've amended it maybe 3 times to account for kids that have been born, a business. So you've got 3 or 4 or 5 different amendments. And the attorney is like, oh my gosh, this is getting confusing. Let's, because we've got all these different amendments that we've got to go back and read through. Let's just amend and restate. So we'll stay with the title, we'll stay with the original date, so you don't have to go and redo anything on the house or your bank accounts.
Oh, interesting.
But then it just redoes the document from scratch at that point in time. And so there's lots of times that the changes are significant enough that we would go through that restatement as opposed to just a single provision amendment, if that makes sense to you.
Yep, that makes sense.
And then sometimes people just redo the whole trust. Change the name, they change everything. They just, usually that's if they find a new attorney. The problem with that though is, like Rex said, now you've got to go back and you got to retitle your house because the house is in the title of the old trust, and so the new trust.
But if you go through, say, a divorce and you live in a new house, and those are some big life changes, and so that might affect.
Yeah, a divorce very likely changes your whole estate plan. More likely than not. Moving, not so much, right? We just change
the address.
Right.
Well, and lots of times if the trust is written well, we're not specifying the address of the house in the trust document itself, right? We're just referencing real estate assets. And that way, as your home changes, as your real estate life changes.
What if it's in title? Because Brandon.
But you'll change the title, right? So you'll sell your old house. When you sell your old house, you're signing as trustee. Hey, I'm the trustee. I have authorization to sell this house. You sell it. The proceeds go into your new house. You're signing on your new house. Hey, this is going to be owned by the Brandon Jessica Living Trust, whatever it is, and you sign as trustee. But yeah, you're not.
It doesn't change the trust document though.
Okay, interesting.
So and if you own a business, lots of times what will happen is you'll own a business in an LLC, an S corp, a C corp, some sort of corporation, but your trust owns your interest in that business. And so you still run your business as the manager, as the CEO, the president, whatever the role and title is, but the ownership is actually through the trust that owns the LLC, so that it can still direct the proceeds of how that's going to happen. And so that does get a little bit more complex. That's probably more in the 10% that we deal with, right, or 15% that we're dealing with more complex things like that, as opposed to the 80. So
Okay.
Yeah.
I interrupted your life cycle, Brandon.
No, that's all right. That was a good tangent. So then the next cycle, and this sometimes happens, but usually doesn't, but that's where the grantor and trustees are alive, but incapacitated. For whatever reason, they're unable to make decisions for themselves. That might be an accident, like a car accident. That might just be old age and inability to handle their finances. In that phase, then the successor trustee is able to. So, like, for example, if I was if my wife and I were in a car accident, we're both unable to respond or answer. My successor trustee, in this case my mom, could go to Rex and say, hey, Rex, we need to cover some serious medical bills, or we need this for the kids, or whatever it is. She could go to him, and because she has authorization, and because my investment account is in the name of the trust, not just the beneficiary, this is a non-qualified investment account, is in the name of the trust, she could direct Rex and say, hey, sell this much in assets and send it to the bank. And then she has authorization to spend that. And so obviously there are some verifications and things that need to go on, but it makes that possible. Whereas before it wouldn't be possible, right? I would have still been alive. You can't sell my assets. If I'm like in a coma, right? Someone can't go and liquidate my accounts and say it's for my own good unless I've authorized them to do that. And so that's maybe that cycle of incapacity. If I'm unable to do something, then the successor trustee, according to the trust, can take care of me and take care of my kids.
So let's pause and talk about the process of that, right? Because that sounds a little bit confusing.
Yeah.
And so the most common that we run across is maybe dementia or memory loss or things like that as our clients age.
Yeah.
And so
but you could get in an accident on a job
You
site,
could.
and it could happen like tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Or you could go into a coma or anything, right? So any incapacity to where you no longer can make logical decisions, financial decisions. Then essentially what would happen is in the process is you would end up with typically a doctor's note saying, so-and-so is incapacitated and can no longer care for themselves financially. And so with that document then, the trust, if it's well written, has already accounted for that eventuality. And so nothing has to happen on the trust, but the successor trustee is now the trustee at this point with that medical doctor's note. And so when they go to a financial institution, the financial institution is going to say, okay, who's the grantors, who's the trustees, and now you would be listed as the trustee, as the legal trustee with that medical note, because if they read the trust and they go through it, they'll say, oh, no, Joe and Jane were trustees, Joe and Jane are now incapacitated, and so Jim Bob is now the successor trustee. So
Okay.
Now,
that's how that would go through.
Yeah, that's great clarification. One point on that probably goes without saying, but like if I were in an accident incapacitated, but my wife was still capable, right? She's still a trustee on the trust, right? And so she could make all the decisions and nothing would really change.
Sure.
It's in that eventuality or in that case that both trustees, are unable to act.
Okay.
So yeah, that doesn't always happen. In fact, probably most times that phase is skipped, right? It goes from being completely competent, capable to passing away. And then that's the final phase, which is the distribution phase. And that typically goes pretty quick. That's a 1-2 year process where the successor trustee is saying, all right, mom and dad said to liquidate all their stuff, split it equally, or send it into these trusts, whatever the document says.
That sounds longer than I thought. I thought it'd be a few months.
It can be, but usually, I mean, it just depends, right? I was talking to a client just the other day who's like, hey, my parents, we didn't sell the house for like a year, and we had time to come back to the house. The trust paid for all the expenses. We could come to the house, hang out, sort through the stuff, and take our time.
Yeah.
And maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. But you can specify that in the trust, or just leave some leeway for the beneficiaries or the successor trustees to decide on that and say, hey, I want this house sold immediately, or I want this house sold, within a reasonable amount of time, or give yourself a year or whatever it is. But yeah, selling real estate, distributing assets, that can take, usually most of the assets are out within a few months and settled, but it can take more time.
That's true, because if you got a house or a business you're trying to sell, it might take a hot minute. Okay.
Well, and you don't want to do it in a fire sale, right? You want to be able to to sit there and maximize the value out of that asset.
And what's the time frame? Is there a max time frame? Like you have to do it within 5 years or something?
So
or
most trusts have a provision in there that's called the in perpetuity provision, and essentially means that the trust legally cannot go on forever.
Sure.
And so most of the time they write in there that it's 99 years beyond death or something.
So you can wait for a favorable real estate market, I guess, to sell a asset maybe.
Depends on what you put in the trust, right? Completely up to you. And you might even, and I've seen this, where people will say, hey, I don't know that I trust my kids to manage these assets, right? And so I'm going to leave this trust in effect for the next 30 years. Even though my spouse, we've passed, I'm going to keep this trust in place, and it's going to pay my kids dividends, right? It's going to pay my kids a monthly allotment for a certain amount of time. And you can do that. Most times, though, we see it just get fully liquidated.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. I mean, we have one trust that we're working on now that's been in place for 45 years.
Really?
Right?
Yeah.
And it probably will get wrapped up in the next 5. And so we're waiting for one final passing to occur before it will finally be closed out. But and so this is where the creativity pops in. But that successor trustee has a dual role. And so they need to try and follow the trust. Well, they don't need to try. They need to follow the rules of the trust. But then they also have a fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries and to try and not only maximize the value of the assets and get it over to them, but there's also something to be said for being expedient, right? And getting the assets transferred in a timely manner and not just delaying for the sake of delay, just because emotionally you as a successor trustee are having a hard time closing this out because it feels like finality on the relationship with your parents or with a loved one. And so you still need to be, a little bit cognizant of trying to get through things and get it done. The other thing that you'll have finally is when that passes and the successor trustee is dealing with it, there's a couple of process things that happen. One, when you pass away, your Social Security number passes away with you, if you will, meaning that you could, most of the time when you have a trust, it's in your Social Security number, and that's why you're not having to do a separate trust tax return during your life. You just do a married filed jointly tax return during your lifetime. But when you pass, you can't do that anymore because you've passed, and there's, no longer married. And so you're no longer, those things end.
Yeah.
And so then we have to go to Social Security Administration, get a new tax ID number for the trust. And that puts the trust into a different tax bracket, into its own unique tax bracket filing system, which is significantly higher than you as an individual. And so now those assets are subject to those higher taxes. And that's another reason
I would never thought about that.
So we want to do that. And then you have that final tax return. So, it's still when you sell the house, let's say you wait till next year to sell the house, you may have some capital gains on that house from the time of when they pass to what the value is then. You may have dividends and interest in an investment account, things like that you're still going to have to pay income taxes from the trust on. And so it gets a little bit more complex to where you have to keep a little bit of money aside. You don't have to, but it's lots of times easier to keep a little bit of money aside as opposed to going to 5 siblings and saying, hey, we owe $10,000 to the IRS. Well, all of you give me $2,000 back. Right. And so typically you do an initial distribution to the beneficiaries, keep a little bit aside, and then typically you do a final distribution after we've paid all the final bills, all the last tax returns. Everything is finished up. Then we do a final distribution typically.
Okay. Brandon, you got some more numbers?
Yeah, you bet. So I thought this was
interesting.
Dang it.
He thought it was dang it.
Oh, that's pretty great.
Oh man. All right. I gotta find a new phrase.
That's fantastic. But you caught yourself. That was so funny. Yeah.
So
these are always interesting. That's the joke.
Yeah.
So for those listening for the first time, these are always pretty good.
Yeah. So the Social Security, we get a lot of questions on Social Security and Social Security solvency. And so this one actually is from the Social Security Administration. First Trust kind of put it together for us, but it shows the number of covered workers per Social Security beneficiary. So how many people are paying in versus how many people are pulling money out.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
1945, there were 41.9 people paying in for every one person taking out, right? That's early on. Now that quickly
Making
dropped.
bank there,
Right,
yeah.
right.
No, that was 6 years into the Social Security system.
Right, that's
Oh.
right at the first.
Right. And so that's why you don't have a lot of people pulling it out
Yeah.
because it had only been in place for about 6 years. At
Right.
that point.
That quickly drops to 8.6 and 10 years later in 1955, and then to more of a normal number by 1965, so 20 years after kind of that first number. At 1965, it's at 4. So that's kind of where...
Or paying in? Or?
4 paying in for every one person pulling out.
Okay.
By 1975, it drops to 3.2, and it sits there at 3.2, and then goes to 3.3, 3.3, 3.3. By 2015, it drops to 2.8. So 2005, it's at 3.3 still. 2015, 2.8. Right now, we're at about 2.7.
So it's still making money.
So we're not insolvent yet.
Yeah.
We're headed towards that, and part of that is there's the baby boomer demographic behind
Sure,
this, right?
sure.
That it's not just straight numbers. They project by 2035 we go from 2.7 down to 2.4, 2050 2.2, and 2100 that's a good year at 2.1.
So the millennials should have had more kids.
We should have had more kids.
Oh.
Not all of us can live.
We
up
can't
to
blame
you.
you.
I did my part. 7 kids. I'm good.
So what's the insolvency number? Like
Right.
1 to 1, or what is it?
Well, so and that's what's interesting. So peak world population is kind of 2086, depending on the projection. I was looking at this just yesterday. It's about 2050 where you start to plateau a little bit, which is crazy. That's not very long from now, right?
Right,
26 years from now. But I think the takeaway on this is, yeah, we're in kind of a bad situation, 2.7. Yeah, that's going to work its way down to 2.4, 2.2. It's not completely insolvent. In fact, one of the more recent kind of, it's not a study, but they come out and say where Social Security's at. As it stands right now, Social Security is likely going to run out of money kind of in that 2035 time period. At that point, they think that money being paid in by those younger workers will cover approximately 76% of the benefits they've promised to pay out. And so that's not a good thing, right? We would hope that it would be 100%. Like, hey, we've matched things, right? And we're going to
sort
be
of the
solvent.
point, yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's not like we talk to a lot of people who think, oh yeah, Social Security will be gone in 5 years, right? And just no payments. And that's, anything's possible, but that's highly unlikely. Worst case scenario, nobody changes anything, and then they just say, sorry, we just pay what we have, and you're about 3/4 of your benefit. And so those numbers are always changing and modifying, but that's kind of where we're sitting, is a relatively stable, not fully solvent place.
Yeah, five years ago, they were predicting that Social Security would hit that apex to where, it would be reduced to 76% in 2032. And so over the last 5 years, that's been extended out to 2035. And basically that's because of strong financial markets over the last, and obviously
people
we've had our
paying in.
bumps,
Right.
in 22 and COVID with 20. But all in all, the market's been fairly strong. So.
All right. Well, back to trusts. What documents? Suck docs. How many docs are involved? This is all run through the attorney. Like, what do we have to do here?
Yeah, so usually when you meet with an estate planning attorney and say, hey, I want to do my trust, right? Usually that includes all of the estate documents. So you do a trust, but not only do you do a trust, but you're doing your durable power of attorney. You're doing your medical power of attorney, your healthcare directive, your pour over will, and your guardianship.
Well, it sounds like a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's not as bad. It's a couple meetings, right?
Yeah.
It's 5 or 6 documents.
Yeah.
And that's kind of covered in that $1,500 to $4,000 cost, right? $1,500 and is all of those different documents, and each one has a very specific purpose, right? The trust again is directing who gets the house and when they get it, or who gets the investment account and when they get it, and how much of that they get. Do they get 25%? Do they have to wait till they're 25? Can it be used for education and maintenance and things like that? And then the durable powers of attorney, those are financial in nature, and so that means that, if you forgot to place an account and you're still living into the name of the trust, then they could go and sign and they could place it in it. But essentially, they have immediate, which means immediately I can do it, or they have springing, that means that kind of springs into action when you become incapacitated. But those documents die with you. Durable powers of attorney pass away when you pass away. And so somebody can't go and sign for you the day after you pass. That's an illegal signature. That's a fraudulent signature. So you have that, and then you've got your what we call pour-over wills, or just-in-case wills is what some attorneys call them. And again, that's just in case you forgot to put a bank account into the name of the trust. It tells the court, hey, I've got this trust over here on the right, in my right hand, and I forgot this account that's over here in my left hand. I need your authority to put me as personal representative to move it over.
So a judge can look at that and say, oh, yeah, he wanted that to go in the trust, right? It's just like a will. It's not illegal. The judge isn't legally required to move, but more likely than not will, because it's just an easy solution.
Yeah, it's an easy direction for a judge.
Yeah.
And then you've got your medical power of attorney, and so essentially this just allows people to get your prescriptions, to get your medical records, to sign for medical releases, things like that during your lifetime. Again, it can be immediate, it can be springing. And then you've got your living will or your medical directive, and this is, do I want to be on machines? Do I not want to be, do I want, breathing assistance? Do I not want breathing assistance? Those kinds of decisions. And most of the time, most states now have healthcare directives. And so, those two names are synonymous for the most part as far as living will and healthcare directives, to where they're accomplishing the same goal. And some hospitals, you've got a little more red tape to go through if it's just the living will, versus the state's healthcare directive typically flows a little bit smoother at those medical institutions.
And those sound like it would be easy, just like, oh yeah, check box, check. But it's emotionally a little bit trying. I remember, we spent 2 weeks, just like, all right, if we weren't here, who's going to raise our kids? And it's just like, whoa,
No, these are big questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're harder, they were harder for me anyway. It was harder for us to answer than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately the peace of mind that comes from that holy cow, if something were to happen to me, I love the mess that I leave behind is actually quite organized. Is it optimal? No, right? It's not, but I love it, right? I love that my kids are going to be taken care of, that I'm not just going to dump a ton of money on them, all at once, but I've actually kind of structured that out so they get a little bit up front and a little bit later so they can practice managing money, and then the larger amounts later in life, hopefully once they're more established. And we also, just for fun, we set up a vacation fund, because there'd be plenty of assets, and so we set aside a certain amount of money that would be set aside on both sides of our family to pay for vacations, so that the kids could have more family memories and build those extended family relationships. And so it's kind of fun to build that out and to jump on an airplane, and I trust airplanes, but know that if something happened, my kids are taken care of, and they've got a good shot at life, and so.
I didn't know you were going there with the airplanes, and then you made
I really do.
Bad.
I trust.
I guess.
I love to fly RC airplanes.
Yeah.
I've actually designed an airplane and built it, and
Wow.
That's awesome.
It was a mediocre airplane at best, but it flew.
Not a passenger airplane.
So is this I'm taking the whole family to Disneyland vacation fund, or is this hey, you can go buy a $49.99 pup tent at Walmart kind of vacation?
No, it's a good vacation fund, but there's also leeway to that, right? Like there's this much dollars. I'd estimate that you'd spend about this, but whatever you want to do, and there's a trustee that's set to manage, what that is, and my guess is the families just kind of decide hey, we want 4 amazing vacations or ongoing.
It's interesting, but as people are doing their trust, one of the other common mistakes, or at least in my mind, a mistake that people make, is they start using hard dollar amounts in the trust.
Right.
And so they say, hey, I want...
Rather than percentages?
Right. And so they say, I want $10,000 to go to so-and-so when I pass, and I want $100,000 to go to this group when I pass. And next thing you know, their estate's worth 110, and they've got 90% of it going away from family, and the family gets 10, right? And so we really do advocate for using percentages for that exact reason, and that's one of the things that we want to
Is that
review.
the attorney's fault?
I don't think it's anybody's fault. I think it's just people get in their own mind kind of what they want to do, and sometimes attorneys will make that recommendation one direction or the other, and sometimes attorneys don't make recommendations. Sometimes they're just If somebody comes in and they say, hey, I want to give $10,000 to so-and-so, it's not necessarily an attorney's job to change their mind, right? Now, could they go through different examples and say, you might think about this.
Sure.
That's my preference in an attorney personally, right? Is I want somebody that's going to give me a lot of examples of how that's worked out really well and a lot of examples of how that doesn't work out so well. So I can make my own informed decision as to what's going to work for me and my family.
Yeah. Okay. Rex, any last comments on Revocable Living Family Trust?
No, other than I don't think you're ever too young to get started. Well, I shouldn't say ever too young. I guess if you're two. But I think you should start getting your trust and your estate plan in order. Either, when you start having, a marriage and kids and things like that, or if you amass some wealth at a young age, then I think you should get those things started. I don't think you have to wait till you're 70 to get started. And unfortunately, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But
Brandon?
if you're 70 or 80 and you don't have a trust, it almost becomes a no-brainer, right? The cost of the trust is likely going to be a lot less than the cost of going through probate. And so I think the most important, and this is probably just my opinion, but when you're young and you have young kids, I think trusts are so important. When you're older and higher risk of passing, trusts are really important. And then in those middle ages, it's good. It's a good idea to do. It's going to make life a lot better for your survivors. But those are the two big ones that I'm just like, holy cow, you need it. You need to trust.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. Okay. Great. Thank you so much for your information on Revocable Living Family Trusts. I hope that was helpful for everyone listening. Want to remind everyone that Through the Pines is available on YouTube. You can, if you're listening to this podcast, you can actually watch our wonderful, beautiful faces on YouTube. Head on over to Through the Pines on that particular platform, and also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Pines Podcast. This has been Through the Pines, reminding you to use yesterday's dollars to finance tomorrow's dreams.